so we can start with Søren's talk. Søren, please share your screen and take it from here.
Yeah, so I also want to take the chance to thank the organizers for putting together this meeting. So I'm going to talk about structural learning in a particular type of stochastic process. And to get started, and before I give an overview of the talk, we need to agree what a point process is. So essentially, we assume that we observe some data that we can think of as these n streams of events. So essentially, we have n different sequences of random event times. And from this, we can construct a point process. And I'll just give you an illustration of this. So over some time interval, we observe some events, and each event is illustrated here with a dot. And for each event, we know the time at which it occurs, and we know in which of the coordinate processes it occurs. So in this case, in this example, there are 4 coordinate processes. And in a way that I'll make precise later, these events may spark or generate events in other in the other coordinate processes. And I'll make so essentially we'll visualize this with a graph. So in this graph, this would encode that the red type of event, so the red is in the top left and the green in the top right, that a red type event could generate future green type events. And I'll also make precise exactly what this graph means. But essentially, from some data that we have at the top, some point process data, I want to figure out what the underlying data generating structure is like. And while we're at the definitions, we also need to know what a counting process is. An accounting process is simply you take one of the coordinate processes, so that's alpha in this case, in the set V. So V is going to be the node set, but also the coordinate process index set throughout the talk. And the counting process corresponding to alpha is basically just a step function that counts how many events we've had up until some time point t. So that's also a stochastic process. Okay, so this talk is really about assuming that we observe data from, or that we have access to the distribution of a linear Hawkes process. From this, we will define something that we're going to call the integrated Hawkes covariance, and it observes a very nice equation. And I know many of you are familiar with linear structural equation models, and you will see that this equation is essentially the covariance matrix of such a model. And from this, we can derive some constraints that we can use to tell apart these graphical structures and do structural learning. So this is essentially the very short version of this talk. Okay, so to define what a Hawkes process is, I need to, or one way to do it is by assuming something about the intensities. So if I have a counting process, n-dimensional counting process, there's an n-dimensional intensity process, so that's also an n coordinates of stochastic processes, and an intensity is essentially something that describes at each time point t how likely am I to observe a new event in the immediate future. So that's what's encoded in the bottom equation. So this essentially says that if I look at a very small time interval, then the intensity of the alpha process describes how likely I am to observe an event, which would make this difference of the counting processes equal to 1, meaning that an event occurred. Okay, and a linear Hawkes process is just a point process, but with a certain condition on the intensities. Essentially, that the intensities is a linear filter of previous events. So what do I mean by that? So I have my intensity in the beta process that's decomposed as a constant term mu, which is the rate with which we have exogenous events in this in this process. Then we have a sum over the coordinate processes, and then we have a sum over previous events. And then you can see that this G function essentially describes how and if alpha events make it more likely to see more beta events in the future. And when I say more, this is because these processes are purely excitatory. There's no inhibition. So when you observe an event, it's only going to spark more events. It's not going to inhibit anything. And the case I'm interested in is when some of these G functions are identically zero, in which case we do get some sparsity in this multivariate process. Okay, so we want some kind of a graphical representation of this, and I'm going to call that a causal graph, and that's I'm going to postpone towards the end of my talk. I'm going to give a sketch of a causal interpretation, so bear with me until then. So essentially, we're just going to make a directed graph such that we have the directed edge from alpha to beta, if and only if this G function is not identically zero. So it's not the zero function. And this, I mean, intuitively, it makes sense. It means that when I see a alpha event, it's going to increase the intensity of the beta process, and that's going to possibly give me more beta events. I also need a representation of this in the partially observed case. And when I talk about partial observation, it's always the case that some of the coordinate processes are fully unobserved. So if you go to the bottom left, here I have a graphical representation of a 6-dimensional process, but let's say that I don't observe processes 5 and 6, in which case I can make a latent projection, which would be the graph above it with the red bidirected edges. And a latent projection is a standard way to do this. I'm not going to give a definition, but this is a representation, this is a graphical representation of the system when I have unobserved processes. And you can see in this case, the 5 and 6 processes, they are acting as confounding, so I get these bidirected edges. Okay, so now I want to go to the meat of the talk. So we need to define this integrated Hawkes covariance. So remember that, I mean, this process is a stochastic process, and now we define an integrated measure of covariance, so one that has no notion of time. So we define this n times n matrix C such that each entry is this integral. And let's see what's under the integral first. Under the integral is essentially a covariance of the, so I should also say that this dn notation is a differential. So it's an infinitesimal jump in the n beta process. So we have essentially an infinitesimal covariance under the integral. And then I do that I integrate over all tau. So we do this over the entirety of the process. And then I get this integrated measure of covariance between the coordinate processes. And I end up with C, which is an n times n matrix. So this is an observable quantity. So when I only have partial observation, then I'll denote the observable part of this matrix by sigma. And it's this matrix that has a very nice representation, because I can, under some regularity, I can write it as is done in the proposition. So you can see, so I should also say here that these matrices phi and lambda, they have a sparsity which is encoded by the latent projection. So essentially, if I have that the latent projection onto the observed variables, that there's no directed edge from alpha to beta, then I have a certain sparsity in the phi matrix. And if there's no bidirected edge, then I have a certain sparsity in the lambda matrix. And this is almost identical to what you get from a linear structural equation model. So just for completeness, I have it in the bottom left here. So in a linear structural equation model, that's so in this case, this is a model of a random vector X, where you have a matrix B, you have a mean vector, or you have this, you can say mean parameter mu, and then you normally assume Gaussian noise epsilon. And in this case, you get a covariance matrix of X, which has the same form, essentially. There's the transposition, but this is due to different conventions and different subfields. Okay, so the only thing which is different is the fact that in the proposition, in the Hawkes covariance, I don't necessarily have that the phi matrix has zeros on the diagonal. So that's a common assumption for the linear structural equation model, but I can easily rewrite it to get a representation such that this phi matrix actually does have zeros on the diagonal. And this is very useful as we'll see. In the linear structural equation model, we have a very simple interpretation of the entries of B, you can see, and we also have that in the phi matrix, because the phi, the beta alpha entry of the phi matrix is essentially this integral. So it's this cumulative measure of influence from alpha to beta. So this is easily interpretable. Okay, so some things. So I'll jump to why this is interesting a little bit. Just to note somewhat of a difference from the linear SEM case is the following. So let's say that I start from a fully observed model. So in an example, we have the graph in A. In this case, I have the top representation, so C equals this expression. If I marginalize, so now I marginalize away 5, for instance, I still have this representation. This is the same in the linear SEM case, of course. But if I assume that my phi 0 matrix is what I call sure stable, so this means that its spectral radius is less than 1. And this means that if you take the absolute values of all of its eigenvalues and take the max of that, then it's less than 1. This is a very common assumption for these Hawkes processes, because if I assume that, I can assume to have stationary intensities. Otherwise, you can get exploding stuff. So if I assume this sure stability about the phi 0, then this is preserved under marginalization. So this means that phi will also be sure stable. It's also preserved under normalization, and normalization is what we do to obtain these zeros on the phi diagonal. And this is different from the linear SEM. In the linear SEM, it's very easy to make a counterexample. So if you start with something sure stable and you marginalize, you do not retain this. And the reason why you do it in this case is because the parameters are all non-negative, and then you can show this this result. Okay, so this proposition tells why I think this is interesting. So first of all, I should say one thing to note is that I start out from a stochastic process, and now I give you an algebraic equation which knows nothing about time, but I can actually use it to impose constraints on the graphical structure. So I think this is not entirely obvious. This is the way it should work. So what the proposition says is that if I now take my standard literature on linear structural equation models, there's a lot of work on those. I can actually apply a lot of it in the structured learning of the Hawkes processes. And in particular, if I can find equality constraints using this linear SEM literature, these will also be satisfied by this integrated Hawkes covariance equation. And I can use these to do structured learning then. Okay, so let's take an example of this. So again, in A, I have this fully observed system, but let's say that again, the process 5 is not observed, and I get the latent projection in B. So this graphical structure imposes a constraint on the observable quantity, the sigma matrix, and the constraint is on the slide. And this normalized parameter phi tilde 3,2 is identified. So this is a constraint that I can read off from the observable quantity, the sigma matrix. And this is a constraint that distinguishes between graphs B and C. So if I do structure learning, I can now use this constraint to distinguish between them. And this is, of course, for many of you, very well-known stuff. But the new thing is really that this also applies when I'm doing local independence structured learning, because again, this is, I mean, the object, the distribution is the distribution of this Hawkes process. So what people have been doing for structured learning when you have partial observation is mostly, or at least in part, based on local independence. Local independence is analogous to conditional independence, but just caters to these continuous time stochastic processes. So this is an example. So the graphs B and C are examples of Markov equivalent graphs under local independence that I can distinguish with these equality constraints. Okay, so other results also transfer, identification results can also be used. We can also obtain even stronger identification results because we have a smaller parameter space. We assume that the phi matrix is sure stable, and we also have this positivity constraint of the parameters. Okay, so towards the end of my talk, I'll sketch one way to define a causal model in this model class. And I think it's a very simple and very neat way of doing it. So I introduced the linear, or defined the linear Hawkes processes by a constraint on how their intensities should look. But you can also do it in a different way. You can define them as branching processes. And in the bottom, I have a plot. And essentially, you can give an equivalent mathematical definition of these processes where, I mean, one event actually does create new events with some rate. So you get this tree structure. So so for instance, we have the first event in the third coordinate process, which in the first generation creates 2 green events, and the first green event creates a red event, and so on and so forth. And using this tree structure, which is inherent in the linear Hawkes process, I mean, we have all we need for causality, right? Because had I not had the first blue event, of course, the tree wouldn't have been there. And if I want to define then a causal model, I can assume, for instance, that if I were to inject an exogenous event, so I make an intervention now, I force, for instance, a blue event, then the cluster that propagates through the process should have the same distribution as the endogenous event, the non-interventional events. And this is essentially one definition of a causal Hawkes process. And if we agree that this is a nice way to define a causal Hawkes process, then things like direct causal effects and total causal effects are very simple and very natural. Because if I go back to this phi 0 matrix, which is defined as on the slide, then the beta alpha entry of this matrix is the expected number of first generation beta descendants that spring directly from an alpha event. So this means that if I assume my prior causal assumption, then if I am to inject one alpha event, this is how many beta events I should expect to be created directly from this. So this is a way to define a direct causal effect. And actually, if I take powers of this matrix, I get the expected number of n generation beta descendants. So if I sum all of them, I can get a matrix which gives me the total number of expected descendants. And now again, it becomes important that I assume this sure stability because it ensures that this R matrix, or like that the sum which defines the R matrix is actually convergent. Okay, so some ways to further this line of thought. This is only using the covariance or the integrated covariance. You could also use higher order integrated cumulants because they are not 0. And this is somewhat analogous to this recent paper by Robova and Sebi. And so they studied in the acyclic case and non-Gaussian, of course. Of course, this also raises the question of, is this possible to do the same thing in more general classes of processes? So you could say, well, this is only for the linear Hawkes process. This is a very simple process. You can do this parametric thing. And at least it hints that maybe it's possible to do something with a cumulative or integrated measure, right? This is something that's interesting for me, at least, that, for instance, the local independence, which has been used for structural learning in these processes, really has a notion of time, but this just finds, you could say, to this set of equations. You could also think maybe it's then possible to find, I mean, not a stationary distribution, but something like a stationary distribution that would impose these constraints. And with this, I think it's time to conclude my talk.
Thanks a lot, Søren. That was great. Is there any question? There's a question in the Q&A from Alex Marks, and they're asking, can you please explain again why the two graphs B and C on slide 10, I think, and Markov equivalent in the context, in this context?
Yeah.
Aren't the causal skeletons different?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a good question. So for this class of graphs, you don't need to have the same skeleton to have Markov equivalence. So essentially, what this uses is something called delta or mu separation, which gives kind of a dynamic Markov property, global Markov property. And in this case, you just have the same separation. So in this class of graphs and with this separation criterion, it's not necessary for Markov equivalent graphs to have the same skeleton.
Okay, great. There's a question from Thomas Richardson. Please unmute yourself, Thomas.
Søren, there's other lines of work where people look at feedback that Joris and Bongers and Tineke Blom have looked at, where look at equations, and I'm just thinking there's some similarities in the process, and they're looking at sort of limiting distribution. It's deeply knows that.
Did you understand, Søren? Otherwise, I can
sorry,
try.
I don't know if it was my connection, but
No. I can try to interpret. I think Thomas was saying something about the work that Joris Moy and Tineke Blom were doing on the cyclic extensions to feedbacks and what happens when there are like differential equations. And I think maybe Thomas can help me there. And how do you think is it connected?
That was it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. That's a very good question as well. I haven't looked in. I'm familiar with that work, and there should be a lot of overlap. I think the technical, when you get down to the math, I think it's going to be different. And I think it's different. I think it's going to be difficult to kind of unite it or find a unified approach to it, because these are quite different as, if you look at an ODE and a point process, they're quite different types of processes, but maybe one can find a more unified approach to this. So maybe that's something to look at more.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. There is a question from Ilya on the chat. Ilya, do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, sorry, this is a silly question because I'm sure you thought about this. So, there is, people do maximal graphs to avoid this whole skeleton disagreement issue, right? In classical search. So for ancestral graphs, this is known, and then there are these generalizations now for graphs, for sort of graphs with Verma constraints as well. And so probably there is something like that here as well, right?
Yeah, there is. So for this class of graphs, if you look at the Markov equivalence class, there's a unique maximal element.
Is that okay? So that's kind of an implicit construction, isn't it? Is there another way to get it by looking at
Yeah, so
without enumerating the class, basically.
Yeah. So actually constructing it is, I mean, okay, yeah, constructing can be hard. And you can say this is an implicit construction. So it's like it's a proof of existence that such an element exists, and it may not be useful, or it might be difficult to actually find it computationally. So this is something I thought about a lot during my thesis work, and the answer is I don't think it's easy to find it. You can make this implicit construction, so you can prove that each equivalence class does have a maximal element, but it's computationally difficult to find it. So I don't think I think it's difficult then also to give a more constructive, description of it.
So you think it's not possible or just unknown? And also, is there a canonical element? Like what if there's more than one maximal thing in the class? Like that's possible, right?
No, that's not possible.
That's interesting. Okay.
There's one and only one maximal element in the class.
Okay, thank you.
So this is very different from the ADMGs.
Right.
But so what I meant is just, we can find it, but it's just a computationally hard problem.
Okay, thank you.
One can also prove that it's co-NP hard.
Oh, it's co-NP. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we have some work on this, but we didn't know what to do with it. So it's actually not it's not published. So we were making these graphs. We wouldn't want people to not like them right off the bat.
I have also a question. Like the last question, if it's okay with you, do you mind? Okay, so I was actually curious about the comment you made on non-stationarity and how would you extend it to that. And I was actually curious in the light of some work that some of us has done, or for example, Kuhn has done, and Biway and others, on exploiting the non-stationarity to actually try to improve the structured learning. So I was kind of curious if you could comment on that.
Yeah, that's also a very good question. So I think for these point processes, it's very common to assume stationarity because essentially the model you're looking at is infinite dimensional because these G functions are functions. If you don't assume something like stationarity, it's extremely hard to do anything, I would think, because you can always explain what's happening. You can have some kind of explosion. That's my intuition, at least. So if you don't have stationarity, so this means that stationarity is a very common assumption, and this is the only thing I've been looking at. And this is also the only case where you get these equations, which we then exploit for the constraints. So the short answer is I don't know.
Okay, sounds good.
Great, awesome. I think we're right on time. If there's no more question, we can move on to the next speaker. Thanks a lot, Søren.
Thank you.